Night hangs thick over the woods of Maryland, summer 1849. Cicadas hum like distant drums. The moon is just a sliver, barely spilling light on narrow paths trodden by bare feet. An enslaved woman crouches beneath the shelter of pines, listening, not for the rustle of hunters, but for a sound she's been told would come. 3 soft hoots of an owl, a signal born from courage and secrecy. She tugs her shawl close, heart steady now. This is not simply escape. It is passage into another kind of world, away from the auction blocks, the lash and the hollow hymns forced to mask grief. Beneath her feet lies an invisible road, marked by whispered directions, carvings on trees, and faith that never wavered. Tonight she moves north, toward a freedom she has never seen, but can already feel breathing just beyond the horizon. Each step sinks into soft soil, yet each one echoes through time. Those echoes built what would later be called the Underground Railroad. And here begins Paths to Freedom. By the beginning of the 19th century, the soil of the American South had grown rich from coerced labor. Cotton, tobacco, and rice fields stretched for miles, their profits feeding the rise of a new industrial age. Beneath that prosperity stood 4 million enslaved men, women, and children, lives bound by law and lash. The 1793 Fugitive Slave Act had already declared that property could never escape its owner. The Constitution itself, in Article 4, echoed the same tyranny. Freedom was not merely forbidden, it was outlawed. Yet where there was oppression, resistance quietly took root. The roots began early, before the term Underground Railroad existed. In the 1700s, enslaved people created maroon communities in swamps such as the Great Dismal Swamp of Virginia and North Carolina, and on the frontiers near Spanish Florida, where the Black Seminoles formed alliances of survival. Stories of these hidden settlements traveled from plantation to plantation like wind-borne prayers. At the same time, the northern states, gradually abolishing slavery after the Revolution, became a flicker on the horizon. Pennsylvania's Gradual Emancipation Act of 1780 created both a precedent and a problem, a line dividing bondage from liberty that could be crossed only through secret help. Philadelphia, Boston, and New York turned into uneasy borderlands between two worlds. Churches, free black communities, and Quaker congregations became sanctuaries for planning. They forged the first quiet pacts to move people north, step by step, night by night. No rails, no trains, no tickets, just a system of trust and code. And as the Cotton Empire expanded with the gin's invention, so too did the will to flee. Every auction, every family torn apart, planted the same question deep inside the human spirit. What if I keep walking until chains no longer exist? Those who asked that question started to carve an invisible road of hope through an America built to deny it. By the 1820s, that invisible road had begun to take form. People started calling it the Underground, not because of tunnels, but because of its secrecy. Railroad entered the language later, after steam engines spread across the continent, an inspiring metaphor for speed, coordination, and unstoppable motion. Conductors, stations, cargo, each term turned defiance into a system. In coastal towns like Wilmington, Delaware, and Newport, Rhode Island, free black sailors carried news from port to port. They smuggled letters, directions, even false passes. Farther inland, churches such as Bethel AME in Philadelphia doubled as meeting points. Candles placed in upper windows told those hiding in the brush that it was safe to approach. Every small gesture rippled into a larger network. The guiding stars were not generals or politicians. They were ordinary people who risked everything. William Still documented hundreds who passed through his office on Philadelphia's Noble Street. In Cincinnati, Levi Coffin's home became a refuge so reliable it was dubbed the Grand Central. And always, songs threaded through the silence, coded spirituals that carried both sorrow and instruction. When one sang of following the drinking gourd, it meant find the Big Dipper, follow north. Harriet Tubman, once Araminta Ross, emerged from Maryland's eastern shore in this crucible of risk. After her own escape, she returned again and again, 13 times by some counts, escorting at least 70 souls to safety, armed with faith and unfailing resolve. But as hope moved north, fear tightened its grip in the South. Slaveholders demanded stronger laws, while vigilance committees in the North organized mutual protection. The nation stood trembling between profit and principle. By the 1830s, whispers of the Underground Railroad spread as far as Canada, and the vision of freedom became not a dream, but a deliberate operation. The boundaries of what was possible had shifted. That tension between the courage to flee and the determination to control would soon ignite a moral and political reckoning. The next decades would measure how far human conscience was willing to travel for liberation. Freedom was never simply found, it was chosen, often in a single night of terrifying resolve. Imagine the moment a person stepped away from a plantation, knowing that turning back meant captivity, and pressing forward could mean death. This decision was the quiet thunder of rebellion within the human heart. Some carried infants swaddled in rags, others clutched pieces of cornbread, family keepsakes, or prayer beads carved from bone. Each mile north erased a certainty, family left behind, faith tested, but it also revealed a new one, a belief that life could belong to the self alone. Those stories, passed later through abolitionist presses and oral tradition, rewrote the very meaning of bravery in America. The courage to flee was matched by the compassion to help. Free black citizens faced fines, violence, and ruin for offering shelter. Quaker farmers risked their land, small-town preachers risked their pulpits. The Underground Railroad fused their moral worlds into one enterprise of defiance. Within the ordeal of slavery, Christianity and African spirituality intertwined into a code of endurance. The field songs, later known as spirituals, were never just devotional. They were operational. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot could signal a chance to move. Wade in the Water urged escapees to travel through streams to mask footprints. Across languages, rhythms, and belief systems, these songs carried instruction and hope. They also anchored a philosophical truth, that freedom was sanctioned by a higher power than any earthly master. Ministers like Henry Highland Garnet preached that resistance was a sacred duty. Church basements served as command centers, reading circles as planning rooms. Faith provided both direction and disguise. To an oppressor's ear, a hymn was obedience. To the singer, it was an anthem of escape. Through courage of flesh and courage of spirit, the fugitives built momentum. Yet the movement would have broken without those who balanced boldness with strategy, empathy with leadership. The women whose names often stayed hidden beneath history's louder voices. In the great narrative of defiance, women were often the unrecorded engineers. Harriet Tubman stands at the forefront, armed, strategic, unflinching, but she was joined by hundreds who walked similar paths. Sojourner Truth traveled the Northeast, not only as an abolitionist speaker, but as living witness that an enslaved woman could claim her voice before a hostile nation. Among free black communities, women like Mary Ann Shadd Carey edited anti-slavery newspapers, instructing fugitives on legal rights and safe settlements in Canada West. Others worked invisibly, cooks, laundresses, midwives, whose homes doubled as safe houses. Their labor was the electricity that powered the railroad's unseen circuits. These women blended pragmatism with vision. They balanced children on one hip and revolution on the other. Every loaf baked, every lantern signal placed in a window, redefined what leadership meant. Theirs was not command by title but by care, an authority born from protecting life itself. Although driven by black initiative, the Underground Railroad thrived on interracial cooperation that defied the norms of its age. Quakers like Thomas Garrett in Delaware, Presbyterians such as John Rankin in Ohio, and countless anonymous farmers opened their barns to fleeing travelers. It was a moral experiment. Could the bonds of justice outweigh the laws of property? Those allies faced persecution too. Fines reached crushing sums. Mobs burned homes. Yet each act of solidarity eroded the notion that slavery was an unshakable pillar of society. White abolitionists learned from black organizing. Black fugitives used those alliances to strengthen political voices in the North. The shared risk blurred racial lines and transformed abstract compassion into practiced equality. In this crucible, communities themselves became conductors. Villages along the Great Lakes and in Upper Canada built schools and churches founded by former fugitives, places where freeborn children recited lessons beside those who had fled bondage. The railroad was thus not only a passage out of slavery, it was a seedbed for a new moral geography of America, where cooperation, once criminal, hinted at the nation's eventual redemption. This widening network of courage, faith, and shared conviction prepared the ground for confrontation on a national scale. When lawmakers sought to silence escape with the stroke of a pen, the country learned just how powerful these hidden tracks had become. In 1850, Congress answered Southern pressure with the most merciless compromise in its history, the Fugitive Slave Act. It declared that no corner of the Union was safe. Federal marshals could seize alleged runaways even in free states. Any citizen who assisted them faced 6 months in jail and crippling fines. Commissioners were paid more for returning fugitives than for releasing them, turning justice into commerce. The law's intent was to choke the Underground Railroad, to make fear do what patrols had failed to achieve. But instead, it exposed the nation's conscience. In Boston, Syracuse, and Milwaukee, crowds stormed jails to free captured individuals. Personal liberty laws sprang up in northern legislatures, asserting that state officers would not enforce bondage. The railroad's routes shifted deeper into secrecy, and its destination stretched further north, to Canada, beyond federal reach. For the enslaved, danger multiplied. Slave catchers scoured border towns. Spies infiltrated free black communities. Yet the response was not retreat, it was escalation. Conductors built false walls and trapdoors in cellars, forged identities, organized night convoys by wagon or by foot across frozen rivers. The movement became a battle of intelligence and endurance fought without weapons. When Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin was published in 1852, it gave sentimental voice to a struggle that black activists had long shouted. But the real thunder came from those continuing the flight. Frederick Douglass, himself once a fugitive, wrote and lectured to crowds across the nation, making escape a public theology of human rights. Every capture, every court case, every rescue deepened the fracture running down the country's center. To defend one human life now meant defying the federal union itself. The drama played out not only in courtrooms, but in attics and cornfields, at train stations where strangers locked eyes and decided in seconds whether trust or betrayal would determine the next sunrise. By the mid-1850s, thousands had reached freedom through routes winding from Maryland to New England, from Kentucky to Detroit, then by boat to Canada. Yet each success illuminated an impossible contradiction. A republic shouting liberty while hunting those who sought it. The 1850s became a decade of open defiance, Every arrest under the new law bred another act of resistance. In 1851, a crowd of free black citizens and white allies in Christiana, Pennsylvania, stood armed at dawn against slave catchers pursuing 4 men. In the chaos that followed, one slaveholder was killed. Southern newspapers screamed insurrection, but abolitionists called it self-defense, the moral spark of a war yet to come. The same year, in Syracuse, activists disguised themselves as laborers, stormed a jail, and freed an enslaved man named Jerry Henry, while church bells drowned the sound of smashing locks. Across the North, newspapers watched the spread of what they called mob law. Yet what the enslaved and their allies saw was the birth of public conscience outrunning legislation. Black vigilance committees in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia operated with near-military precision. Men such as Thomas Downing and David Ruggles coordinated intelligence using letters hidden in harmless-looking cargo. When rescue was impossible, they sent fugitives straight to Canada by rail or by Great Lakes boats. St. Catharines, Ontario, where Harriet Tubman settled many she had guided, grew into a self-sustaining black settlement, a vision of what freedom could look like sustained by community, not mere escape. Then came 1859. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry shattered the last illusions of peaceful compromise. Although few Underground Railroad leaders supported Brown's violent gamble, his execution silenced the notion that the country could remain half slave and half free. As national division festered, enslaved people continued to move north in growing waves. Some followed rivers still, others hid in freight cars or disguised themselves as sailors or servants. Each success mocked the slave power, a quiet victory against the edifice of bondage. 2 years later, the Civil War erupted. At first, Northern generals returned fugitives to their owners until the flood became unstoppable. The Union Army itself turned into a massive artery of liberation. What the Underground Railroad had pioneered, wartime emancipation made official. The clandestine network that once operated under moonlight now stood revealed in the dawn of national reckoning. The war that followed did not simply free the enslaved, it transformed the idea of the United States itself. In 1863, when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it codified what the Underground Railroad had already proven. Freedom could not be contained by law. Once belief in it had crossed the borders of fear. Thousands of former fugitives joined the Union Army. The same men and women who had hidden by moonlight now marched under banners proclaiming liberty. The contraband camps that formed behind northern lines became entry points into citizenship, schools, and families reunited. The North learned, often awkwardly, how courage born in captivity could become the foundation of a freer republic. In the aftermath of battle, conductors and freed people turned their attention from escape to rebuilding. Harriet Tubman settled in Auburn, New York, where she founded a home for the aged and continued to fight for women's rights. William Still compiled his meticulous records of those he had helped, publishing one of the most important first-hand sources on the railroad's inner workings. In Canada, black communities such as Buxton Mission and Dawn Settlement built farms, churches, and schools, living testaments to self-determined freedom. But emancipation did not equal equality. Black codes, discrimination, and racial violence persisted. Yet those who had once carried fugitives across borders now carried petitions and speeches across state houses. They were, in every sense, veterans of the first American freedom movement. The legacy of the Underground Railroad thus survived not just in memory, but in ongoing activism. A blueprint for resisting injustice through unity and unrelenting moral conviction. From hidden rooms to new constitutions, the same question endured. What does it mean to be free? and how do we guard that freedom once gained? After the Civil War, the hidden tracks of the Underground Railroad became visible in unexpected places, not as physical routes, but as symbols inside the nation's renewed conscience. The same churches that had once hidden fugitives now hosted political meetings. The station masters of secrecy became advocates for education and civic inclusion. In 1865, the 13th Amendment sealed slavery's legal demise. Yet the old struggle continued in new guises: sharecropping, disenfranchisement, and racial terror. Against these, descendants of railroad conductors organized schools such as Fisk University and Howard University, translating the movement's secret solidarity into public empowerment. Their classrooms taught the same lesson the woods and rivers once had. Knowledge is a form of flight too. Communities in Canada preserved oral histories of their journeys, holding annual Emancipation Day gatherings that still echo across Windsor, Amherstburg, and Buxton. Each song sung there ties back to those original spirituals that once carried coded maps within melody. Later generations of activists drew openly from this lineage. Ida B. Wells's anti-lynching crusade, the NAACP's legal campaigns, the mid-20th century freedom rides, all borrowed the railroad's principle that justice moves forward only when ordinary people move together. By remembering the clandestine corridors and the courage that built them, Americans began to redefine patriotism not as loyalty to laws, but as loyalty to liberty. Scholars, preservationists, and descendants have since traced routes, restored safe houses, and established the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati to honor that inheritance. What was once a crime has become sacred ground. The whistle of a distant train, a lantern in a museum window, a classroom discussion about courage. Each is an echo of those first travelers who risked everything for a dawn they had never seen. And in that echo, one hears the beginning of all future movements for human dignity. Freedom has always begun in silence. One whisper, one footfall against the dark. On the Underground Road, that silence was filled with heartbeat and faith. It was the sound of people deciding that captivity could no longer define them. Their courage did not abolish all suffering, but it redrew the map of what humanity could mean. When we revisit those paths today, we walk among lessons carved in earth and memory. The Underground Railroad teaches that freedom is both destination and discipline. It demands vigilance, compassion, and the refusal to stand still when others remain bound. The men and women who fled north were not only escaping, they were inventing a moral blueprint for the nation that would eventually follow them. They demonstrated that conscience can be organized, that empathy can be strategic. Their story exposes not the weakness of a divided republic, but its potential for redemption through collective courage. In museums and memorials, we see their faces, sometimes unnamed, sometimes reconstructed from fragments of testimony. Yet beyond the exhibits lies the truer monument. Every act of resistance to injustice that echoes their resolve. Freedom, they remind us, is never delivered. It is built by those willing to move through fear, to build community across boundaries, to keep faith when the way ahead is hidden. That is why the Underground Railroad remains more than history. It is a continuing call to travel inward, to examine what still binds and what must yet be broken. As a nation and as individuals, we inherit both their journey and their unfinished work. The night has passed. The soil is still damp from the weight of their steps. And just beyond the tree line, the sky brightens again. Another beginning on the long road to liberty. This episode of Paths to Freedom honors those who turn pain into legacy,